All my life, I was told I was a mistake. One of my earliest memories is of my mother's face twisted in anger, flinging those words at me like a curse. I couldn't have been older than 5, standing in the kitchen on tiptoes trying to reach a cabinet. I had dropped a glass by accident. It shattered on the linoleum and I froze in fear. My mother's footsteps thudded from the next room. She looked at the broken shards, then at me, and her lips curled into a scowl. "You clumsy mistake," she hissed, grabbing my arm so hard it hurt. "You're lucky we even keep you under our roof." At that age, I didn't fully understand what mistake meant, but I understood the tone. I understood I had done something terrible just by existing. My father reinforced it in his own ways. He was quieter about it than my mother, but no less cruel. Where mother would scream or slap, father would simply stare at me with cold, distant eyes that said I was nothing to him. Sometimes he'd walk right past me, as if I were invisible in our own home. Other times, after a few beers, he'd mutter under his breath, "Should have given you up when we had the chance." I wasn't meant to hear those words, but I did. I always heard them. Each one sank into me heavy and sharp, lodging deep in my heart. We lived in a typical suburban neighborhood. Neat lawns, picket fences, a friendly smile from the mailman. To outsiders, our family probably looked normal enough. My parents held respectable jobs. My father worked at a local hardware store and my mother did bookkeeping from home. They paid the bills, kept the house tidy, even went to church on Sundays. Neighbors would wave and my parents would wave back, wearing polite smiles that hid the rot underneath. Behind closed doors, however, our house was filled with a heavy silence punctuated only by criticism. It was as if any warmth or love that might have lived there had been smothered long ago by resentment. As a child, I spent a lot of time alone in my room. It was safer that way. If I was quiet, if I stayed out of sight, maybe I could avoid their wrath for a little while. I learned to tiptoe on the old wooden floors so they wouldn't creak. I learned the schedules of their moods, avoid mother in the late afternoons. When her headaches came, avoid father on Friday nights after his paycheck when he'd drink. I became a ghost in my own home, trying not to provoke the living. My small bedroom at the end of the hall became my sanctuary. It wasn't much, just a narrow bed, a second-hand dresser with drawers that stuck, and a window that overlooked our backyard. But it was mine. I would curl up on the bed and lose myself in books whenever I could get them. Between the pages of library books, I found temporary escape in worlds where children weren't mistakes, but heroes, where parents loved and protected their kids. I especially loved stories about orphans, because even though those characters had no parents at all, somehow that seemed better than what I had. Orphans in books had adventures. They found friends and found families who chose them. In my darkest moments, I wished I was an orphan too. School was a mixed blessing. On one hand, it got me out of the house for a few hours. I would linger on the walk to school each morning, dragging my feet once I was out of sight of our home just to prolong the freedom. At school, I was quiet and shy, afraid to draw attention to myself. I had few friends. It was hard to invite anyone over or get close to people when you carried a secret like mine. What would they think if they heard my own mother call me a burden, if they saw the fading bruises on my arm from where she'd gripped me too hard? I lied often, telling teachers and classmates that I was fine, that I was just naturally clumsy, or that the shadows under my eyes were from staying up late reading. The lie felt easier than the truth. On the other hand, school could also be another arena for humiliation. Once in second grade, there was a family day where parents were invited to class for an afternoon. I remember begging my mother to come because all the other kids' parents would be there, and I didn't want to be the only one alone. She finally did show up, but halfway through the event, when I proudly showed her a crayon drawing I had made of our family, she frowned in disgust. The drawing was of the three of us smiling in front of our house. It was how I wished we could be, not how we were. My mother's only response was a cold laugh. "What a lie," she said right in front of my teacher and classmates. "We both know we're not that happy, don't we?" My cheeks burned with shame as a hush fell over the small group around us. I wanted the floor to swallow me whole. On the walk home that day, she told me I should stop embarrassing the family with sappy nonsense. That was the last time I ever drew a picture of us. Moments like that taught me it was futile to seek approval or love. Every kind or hopeful impulse I had was crushed under the weight of their disdain. Over time, a quiet sort of despair settled into me. Some nights I overheard my parents talking in their bedroom. Voices muffled, but words still clear enough to sting. They spoke about bills, about stress, and inevitably about me. "He's the reason we're stuck here," my mother would say, spitting the words out. "If it weren't for him, we could have had a better life." My father would just grunt in agreement. I used to press my pillow over my ears, trying to block out their voices, but it was impossible. I absorbed every bit of blame they threw at me. I came to believe them. Children believe their parents even when they shouldn't. If they said I was a mistake, then that's what I was. If they said I was lucky to have a roof over my head, then maybe I was. Perhaps I didn't deserve even that. I remember lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, quietly crying and apologizing to the darkness for being who I was. I prayed sometimes in a childish way, asking whoever might be listening up in heaven to fix me, to make me better, so maybe my parents would love me. The silence that answered was crushing. Still, even in that bleak childhood, tiny sparks of hope glimmered now and then. On a few rare occasions, I felt something almost like love. Once, when I had a terrible flu at age 8, burning with fever, my mother actually stroked my hair and fed me soup. She did it more out of duty than affection, but in my fever haze, I remember leaning into her touch, desperate for that warmth. It vanished as soon as I was well. Another time, my father took me fishing exactly once, perhaps trying to play the role of a normal dad for an afternoon. We barely spoke, and he seemed disappointed when I didn't know how to bait the hook properly. After an hour of silence on the lake, we went home. He never asked me to go again. But for that 1 hour on the lake, sitting next to him, I had allowed myself to imagine what it might feel like if things were different. Those moments, as scarce as they were, kept a small part of me alive inside. A part that quietly yearned for their love against all odds. A part that thought if I just try harder, maybe one day they'll see I'm not a mistake. That hope was stubborn. It lived in the pit of my heart, quietly flickering even as I grew older and reality set in with heavier blows. Little did I know life was about to test me far beyond childish loneliness and longing. The pain they'd caused was only the beginning. As I grew older, the weight of my parents' resentment only grew heavier. In my teenage years, their cruelty shifted from sharp outbursts to a constant grinding pressure. Every day held some new unfairness, some fresh reminder that I was unwanted. If childhood was spent trying to disappear, adolescence forced me to confront just how trapped I was under their roof. When I turned 16, I got a weekend job bagging groceries at a local supermarket. It was the first time I had my own bit of money. I remember the cautious hope I felt opening my first paycheck, a meager $100, but to me, it was a step toward freedom. I fantasized about saving enough to move out the day I turned 18. Foolishly, I even dreamed that if I contributed to household expenses, maybe my parents would soften a little. Perhaps they'd see I wasn't just a burden. So I offered to buy groceries with part of my pay. Instead of appreciation, I was met with sneers. My father snatched the cash from my hand and pocketed it without so much as a thank you. "That's for your share of the bills," he said, though. I knew very well that money would go toward his beer or my mother's endless retail therapy shopping sprees. After that, every paycheck I brought home was taken from me. If I ever hesitated or tried to keep a little for myself, my mother would fix me with that dagger stare. "You live under our roof, you follow our rules. Don't forget you're lucky to be here at all." The words "our roof" always came out twisted, like even the shelter over my head was a gift I didn't deserve. School offered no refuge from the turmoil at home. In fact, it sometimes made things worse. Senior year, I was surprisingly chosen for a small scholarship by one of my teachers, Mrs. Thompson, who had seen potential in my writing. It was only a few $1,000s, but it could have been my ticket to community college or a training program after graduation. Mrs. Thompson called my mother in for a meeting to share the good news and encouraged them to let me pursue further education. I sat in that meeting, heart pounding with a mix of pride and dread. I should have known better than to hope my mother would be anything but dismissive. With a tight, polite smile that only I could recognize as fake, my mother thanked the teacher for her concern and said, "College isn't in the plans for him. We need him at home." I felt my stomach drop. Mrs. Thompson tried to protest, explaining that I had talent, that this was a chance for a better future. But my mother's veneer of politeness vanished. Right in front of my teacher, she said in a cold voice, "We can't waste time or money on dreams. He owes us for everything we've spent raising him. It's payback time." I wanted to disappear into the floor. My teacher looked at me with pity and a hint of outrage, but there was nothing she could do. After we left, my mother berated me in the car, furious that I'd made her look bad by involving the school in family business. That scholarship letter was torn to shreds and tossed out the car window on the drive home. I watched pieces of my hope scatter in the wind along the roadside. At home, things continued to deteriorate. My chores doubled, then tripled. It became clear that my parents intended to squeeze every last benefit from my presence before I inevitably escaped their grasp. I cooked dinner, I cleaned every inch of the house, I did all the yard work. If I missed a spot or burned the food, punishment came swiftly, a slap, a yank of my ear, or hours of being screamed at and called useless and ungrateful. There was never a word of gratitude. I was a live-in servant, repaying a debt for the crime of being born. Each time I handed over my earnings or scrubbed the bathroom floor, resentment in me rose another notch. I tried to keep that small flame of hope alive. The countdown to my 18th birthday became my mantra. "Just hold on," I told myself. "Finish high school, turn 18, then you can leave." I secretly stashed away a few dollars here and there, when I could, small tips from helping a neighbor mow their lawn or coins I found on the sidewalk, anything to build a tiny escape fund without my parents knowing. I hid the money in an old tin can and buried it beneath a loose floorboard in my bedroom. One evening, about 2 months before my graduation, my father stumbled home drunk. It wasn't a common occurrence. He usually drank at home, but that night he had gone to a bar after work. I could smell the whiskey on him the moment he banged open the front door. Unfortunately, I was in the living room folding laundry directly in his path. He looked at me with glassy, unfocused eyes, and something in them snapped. "You," he slurred, stepping toward me unsteadily. I felt a jolt of fear. Usually, I tried to be invisible, but there I was, nowhere to hide. "You cost me everything," he growled. Before I could react, his hand flew out and struck me across the face. It was the first time he'd actually hit my face. My mother was the one who usually delivered slaps, and never where a bruise might show easily. The force knocked me back against the wall, laundry flying from my arms. My cheek burned, and for a split second, I saw stars. I tasted blood where the inside of my cheek had cut against my teeth. My mother watched from the hallway, arms crossed. She didn't intervene. If anything, she looked satisfied to see me finally get what she believed I deserved. "Maybe that'll knock some sense into you," she said bitterly, as I pressed a trembling hand to my face. I'll never forget the way she turned and walked away as if I was so insignificant that witnessing me crumpled on the floor meant nothing. That night, I retrieved the tin can from under the floorboard. I counted the money by flashlight with a shaking hand. $52.13. That was the sum of my freedom. I knew it wasn't enough, but I clung to each crumpled bill and coin like a lifeline. I'd figure something out. I had to. My 18th birthday finally arrived on a sweltering July day. There was no celebration, of course, not even a token happy birthday. Instead, I found a long list of chores waiting for me on the kitchen table, as if it were my mother's idea of a gift. I spent the day working through every task under the brutal summer sun, mowing the lawn, trimming hedges, scrubbing floors, until my hands blistered and sweat burned my eyes. I didn't dare complain. I just wanted to get through it, counting down the hours until I could be free of them. That evening, as I was finishing the last task, my parents called me into the living room. They sat side by side on the couch, a rare united front. I stood awkwardly, wiping my brow, heart thudding in my chest, because I sensed what was coming. My father cleared his throat and spoke, not quite meeting my eyes. "Well, you're an adult now." His tone was almost casual, but I heard the hard edge beneath it. "Your mother and I think it's time you start fending for yourself. We've done our duty raising you." My mother chimed in, voice sickly sweet. "We really think you'll do better on your own, dear." The mock tenderness in the word dear was like a slap to my face, still metaphorically stinging from my father's hit weeks ago. I looked between them, a cold wave of disbelief washing over me, even though I had anticipated this. This is it, I realized. They're really doing it. I managed to croak out, "You're kicking me out tonight." My mother's smile twisted. "We prefer the term moving on. Pack your things. A friend of your father's has a truck. He'll give you a ride to wherever you need to go." There was no concern about where I would actually go. That detail was entirely up to me. I felt lightheaded. Even after everything, some naive part of me had hoped for a hint of remorse from them in this moment, some acknowledgement that this was hard or sad. But there was nothing. Just thinly veiled glee that they would finally be rid of me. My father stood up, already done with the conversation. "Make it quick," he said, not even looking at me. "We want you out by midnight. Midnight. Happy birthday to me." I nodded numbly and turned away so they wouldn't see the tears starting to form. I hurried to my room, the room that had been my only refuge, and shakily pulled out an old duffel bag. I didn't have much, just some clothes, a few battered books, and my hidden tin can of money. As I packed, I felt anger and heartbreak war within me. They didn't even care where I'd sleep that night. After 18 years of telling me I was a burden, they couldn't even grant me the courtesy of a single night to figure things out. At 1:45, I stood by the front door with my duffel bag of meager belongings. A pickup truck idled in the driveway, one of my father's buddies there to drive me wherever I could find shelter. My parents didn't even come out to say goodbye. I cast a final glance at their closed bedroom door, wanting to scream to demand why they hated me so much. But I already knew their answer in their eyes. I had always been a mistake. Swallowing hard, I stepped out into the humid summer night and gently closed the door behind me. The soft click of it echoed with finality. I climbed into the truck without looking back. For the first time, I was free of them, and I was utterly alone. I had no idea what waited for me beyond that cold, unloving house. The night I was cast out, I learned how cold the world could be, even in the middle of summer. My father's buddy dropped me off in front of a 24-hour diner on the edge of town and drove away without a word. There I stood, 18 years old, with a duffel bag and $52 to my name, gazing at flickering neon lights and strangers coming and going. A lump caught in my throat as I realized I truly had nowhere to go. That first night, I didn't sleep at all. I ended up nursing a cup of coffee in the diner until dawn, spending a few precious dollars just to stay indoors a little longer. I was afraid to step back out into the darkness. When the sun finally rose hazy and orange, I felt no warmth from it, only dread for the day ahead. The next weeks blurred into a haze of struggle and loneliness. With no permanent address, it was hard to apply for jobs. I wandered the town looking for help wanted signs, living meal to meal. Sometimes I could afford a cheap motel for a night or two to grab a shower and sleep without fear, but mostly I lived rough. I slept in public parks or under the awning behind the grocery store where I used to work, curling into myself on the hard ground. Every unfamiliar sound in the night set me on edge. A police siren in the distance, the scuttle of a rat, drunken shouts from a nearby alley. It was a far cry from the uneasy quiet of my old bedroom, but at least out here, every harsh word ringing in my head was an echo of the past, not a new dagger from my parents' tongues. Hunger became my constant companion. I rationed what little money I had for cheap-filling foods, packets of crackers, fast food dollar menu items, anything to quiet the gnawing in my stomach. There were days I only ate a single meal. I remember picking up a thrown-away granola bar from a trash can one desperate afternoon, brushing off the dirt and devouring it. With each humiliation, I felt my sense of self unravel a bit more. At my lowest, I truly believed I must deserve this suffering. Why else would my own flesh and blood abandon me so easily? My parents' voices haunted every quiet moment, worthless burden, mistake. It was like they'd planted those words deep in me, and now in their absence the words echoed louder than ever. One sweltering afternoon, I made the mistake of trying to return to my old neighborhood. I don't know what I was looking for. Maybe just a glimpse of my former life, some sense of familiarity. I walked the same tree-lined streets, sweating through my only clean shirt, and paused at the end of my block. From there I could see my house, their house, a 2-story pale blue home that looked as prim as ever. My chest tightened at the sight. In the driveway was my father polishing his car as if it were a prized possession. My mother sat on the porch with a tall glass of iced tea. They looked content, as if nothing had happened, as if I had never existed at all. I was about to turn away when my mother's gaze snapped toward me. Even from a distance, I could see her eyes narrow. She said something to my father, and he looked up, shading his brow with one hand. I froze like a deer, then finally found my feet and hurried away before they could come closer. My face burned with shame. I realized how foolish I'd been to think they might feel any regret or worry about me. To them, I was truly gone, and it made no difference. If I had held any secret hope that my absence might make their hearts grow fonder, that hope died then and there on that sunlit suburban street. After that encounter, I spiraled deeper. I stopped wandering near my old neighborhood. I avoided any place that reminded me of what I'd lost or never had. Instead, I drifted through city streets where no one knew me. Days and nights lost their distinction. I measured time only by when my stomach hurt the worst, or when exhaustion forced my eyes shut. I scavenged, I begged occasionally outside busy stores, though shame made me hide my face. Once a woman in a business suit hurried past and dropped a few coins in front of me, murmuring, "Get yourself something warm, kid." I muttered thanks, tears of gratitude and humiliation burning my eyes. The kindness of strangers was rare and overwhelming. I almost preferred their indifference, which matched how I felt about myself. Shelters were always full or felt too dangerous for someone young and alone like me. I'd heard stories of theft and violence, so I took my chances on the streets. One particularly cold night, a freak chilly spell in late August, I found a hidden spot behind a dumpster and huddled in a pile of cardboard. As I lay there shivering, I wondered if this was how I would die, nameless and alone, just another failed life that ended before it truly began. Part of me was ready to surrender to that fate. At least it would mean the end of hunger and hurt. In those dark moments, I even convinced myself my parents would be relieved if they knew. One less inconvenience for them. It's frightening how clear your thoughts can get at rock bottom. Lying on that hard ground, I reflected on my life with a detachment that was almost eerie. I thought about the boy I had been desperate for a scrap of love. I thought about every cruel thing my parents ever said or did, and every time I tried to be better to earn their affection. And I thought about how none of it was my fault. A realization so long in coming that I almost couldn't believe it. For years I had internalized their hatred as justifiable. But there in the gutter, I finally let myself consider a radical idea. Maybe they were wrong. Maybe I didn't deserve this. Maybe, just maybe, I was not the wretched mistake they painted me to be. That tiny spark of self-recognition should have been comforting, but it only fueled a new kind of pain anger. Anger at the years I lost trying to please people who never would have accepted me. Anger at how I was wasting away now, still under the shadow of their cruelty. The anger lit a fire in me, but it was banked by the weight of my exhaustion and despair. My body was so weak, my mind so tired. It was hard to imagine climbing out of the deep hole I was in. One night, after roughly 2 months on my own, I fell ill. It started as a cold from too many nights exposed to the elements, and it worsened rapidly. I developed a fever and a rattling cough. With no medicine and no safe place to rest, my condition deteriorated. I remember stumbling through downtown streets in a delirium, chills racking my body despite the summer heat. My legs gave out in front of a bus stop bench, and I collapsed, dimly aware of concerned voices around me. The world became a blur of spinning lights and distant sounds. I felt hands lifting me, heard someone calling for an ambulance. Then everything went black. When I regained consciousness, I found myself in a hospital bed, an IV in my arm. I blinked up at harsh fluorescent lights and a white ceiling. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. The sterile smell and the beeping of monitors gave it away. A nurse appeared, gently explaining that I had collapsed from dehydration and pneumonia. She said I was lucky someone found me when they did. I almost laughed at the word lucky. Instead, tears leaked from my eyes. It was hard to say if they were tears of relief at being cared for or tears of despair that it had come to this. In the hospital, I was safe for a short while. I had a roof over my head again, ironically, as a patient. Clean sheets, regular meals, and the first compassion I'd felt in years from the kind nurses who checked on me. But I knew I couldn't stay long. I had no insurance, no money, and once I was stable, they would discharge me back into the world. The day that happened, I sat on the hospital steps with a plastic bag of my few belongings, feeling as healthy as I'd felt in ages, yet utterly terrified. Rock bottom wasn't behind me. I was still in it, just momentarily reprieved. I knew something had to change. Either I would die out there on the streets, or I had to find a way to claw myself up. I wasn't even sure I wanted to keep living, but some stubborn part of me refused to quit. Maybe it was that spark of anger or the faint memory of hope, but I told myself that day, I will not let this be the end of my story. It was a feeble promise, and I had no idea how I would keep it. But it was the first promise I'd made to myself in a long time, and I held on to it with everything I had. I left the hospital with a mixture of trepidation and fragile hope. For the first time since I'd been kicked out, I wasn't on the verge of collapse. I had a clear head and a fierce resolve burning in my chest. The hospital's social worker, a woman named Karen with kind eyes, had given me a list of resources before I walked out the door: addresses of shelters, food pantries, and a local youth program that helped homeless teens and young adults get on their feet. Clutching that paper, I realized I actually had a lifeline, a map, however humble, out of the abyss. Swallowing my pride, I went to a youth shelter the social worker recommended. It was a small facility run by a church with only a dozen beds. I was nervous walking in, expecting judgment or pity. Instead, I was greeted by a tired but gentle counselor named Marcus, who listened as I haltingly explained my situation. To my surprise, Marcus didn't lecture or pry. He just nodded and said, "You're safe here for as long as you need, man." Those simple words nearly brought me to tears. After so long bracing against cruelty, kindness felt disarming. Life at the shelter was a stark contrast to the streets. I had a bunk to sleep in, a locker to keep my few belongings, and 2 hot meals a day. In return, I had to follow basic rules, keep curfew, help with chores, attend a weekly life skills class. Structure, something I'd always associated with my parents' oppressive rules, took on a new light when it was tied to people actually caring about my future. I found myself slowly crawling out of survival mode. With a roof over my head and food in my belly, my mind could finally focus on more than just the next hour. The turning point wasn't a single moment. It was a collection of small victories that started to add up. At the shelter's urging, I enrolled in a free career training program downtown. I chose an automotive repair course. Cars had fascinated me ever since I watched my father tinker with his old Chevy back in the days when I still tried to bond with him. I figured having a trade might ensure I'd never be destitute again. The first day of class, I was shaking with nerves. Surrounded by other young men and women, some from troubled backgrounds like mine, I felt out of place and unsure. But as the instructor handed me a wrench and guided me through the basics of an engine, I felt something unexpected: confidence. Grease on my hands, the smell of motor oil, the satisfaction of loosening a rusty bolt. It grounded me in the present, pushing aside the voices of the past. I wasn't a mistake or a burden in that garage. I was just a student learning a skill, one step at a time. Over the next year, I rebuilt myself alongside the engines and carburetors I learned to fix. I attended every class, often staying late to practice. Marcus and the shelter staff cheered me on, celebrating each certification I earned. When the training program partnered me with a local auto shop for an internship, I poured my heart into it. The shop owner, a gruff, middle-aged man named Don, took notice of my dedication. He didn't know my full story. I was still too ashamed to share the details. But he saw that I worked harder than anyone, and that I had a hunger to prove myself. By the time I turned 19, Don offered me a paid position as a junior mechanic. It was the first real job I'd had since bagging groceries, and it paid enough for me to start saving a little. With a steady income, I eventually moved out of the shelter into a small shared apartment with 2 other guys from the auto shop. It was a dingy 2-bedroom with peeling paint and a perpetually leaking faucet, but to me it was heaven. It was independence. I remember the first night in my own well-shared place. I stretched out on the lumpy couch in the living room after my roommates had gone to bed, and I just listened to the silence. Not an oppressive silence like at my parents' house, but a peaceful quiet that was mine to fill. I cried softly out of sight of anyone letting out years of tension. I had a door that I could close and lock, and behind it I was safe. That knowledge settled something deep inside me. Still, even as my life stabilized, the past kept its hold on me in subtle ways. I carried a chip on my shoulder the size of a boulder. I threw myself into work, often pulling overtime until my muscles ached. On weekends, I took side jobs fixing up neighbors' cars in our apartment parking lot for extra cash. I was driven by more than just the normal desire for a better life. I had a score to settle with fate, it seemed. A voice inside me whispered that every dollar I saved, every skill I learned, was another step toward proving them wrong. I didn't consciously plan revenge in those early days, but the anger and hurt were like coals glowing quietly in my chest, fueling me to never be vulnerable again. As the years passed, my hard work paid off. By 21, I had moved up to senior mechanic at Don's shop. He trusted me with more responsibilities and gave me a fair raise. I also earned a reputation for being the guy who could fix any engine problem thrown at him. The local racing enthusiasts started seeking me out to tweak their cars, which brought in good money. I lived frugally, always mindful of saving. My roommates and I eventually parted ways as I sought a quieter living situation, and I managed to rent a tiny studio apartment of my own. It wasn't much bigger than my childhood bedroom, but it was mine. And every piece of furniture in there I'd bought with my own money. In my personal life, I kept to myself mostly. I had acquaintances, my co-workers, a few neighbors I'd nod to, but I struggled to form deep friendships. I realized I had walls built up high. Trusting people didn't come easily after a lifetime of betrayal by those who were supposed to love me. There were times I felt lonely, but I'd remind myself that loneliness in freedom was far better than the loneliness I had felt under my parents' roof. My education was one thing I hadn't completely given up on. After finishing the automotive program, I decided to take a couple of night classes at the community college. It was slow going with my full-time job, but I wanted to experience the learning I'd been denied. To my surprise, I excelled. Each past exam or essay marked with praise felt like proof that I was more than what my parents made me believe. Yet despite all these positive changes, I couldn't fully let go of my bitterness. I'd occasionally check up on my parents from afar, not physically, as I did that once, but through the modern convenience of the internet. Social media was useful for that. Though my parents had no online presence, they weren't the type to share anything publicly. I found traces of them through old neighbors and community pages. I learned that not long after I left, my father lost his job at the hardware store and struggled to find steady work. My mother's bookkeeping clients dwindled. There was talk in the neighborhood gossip circles about them having money troubles. I took in this information with a conflicted heart. A part of me felt a grim satisfaction. Perhaps this was karma finally catching up to them. Another part of me, one I barely acknowledged, felt a pang of the old hurt. The child in me who still wondered if they ever thought about me, if they regretted what they'd done. It was in those years of building myself up that the idea of confronting them one day began to form in the back of my mind. I never forgot the way I was tossed out like garbage. The memory fueled me during the hard days. When I was lifting a transmission out of a car and my arms were shaking with fatigue, I'd recall my father's cold dismissal and find the strength to keep going. When I studied late into the night, fighting sleep, I'd hear my mother's derisive laugh, and it would ignite a determination to succeed just to spite her. Revenge was never far from my thoughts, though it was abstract at first. A fantasy of returning triumphant just to show them I survived despite everything. That fantasy sharpened into a plan the day I learned that my parents were about to lose the house. I was scrolling through the community page of my old hometown out of morbid curiosity when I saw a post about an estate sale on my childhood street. The address was my parents'. They were selling belongings, furniture, appliances, even my father's beloved Chevy, all in an attempt to stave off foreclosure, the post said. My heart pounded as I read the sympathetic comments from neighbors. Apparently my parents had fallen behind on their mortgage and debts for months. The bank was moving to repossess the house. I sat back, my mind racing with a mix of emotions, shock, dark glee, and oddly a touch of sadness. Despite everything, it was the house I'd grown up in, the stage for all those nightmares. The thought of strangers rummaging through our old things stirred ghosts in my memory. But then I thought of my mother's words. "You're lucky we keep you under our roof." Their roof was about to vanish from over their heads. And in that realization, an idea sparked that made my hands tremble. What if I became the one to take that roof away, just as they had taken mine? It felt almost too poetic to be real. I tried to dismiss the notion as foolish, but it burrowed into my brain and wouldn't let go. I had some savings, but buying a house, that was a huge step. Still, the possibility of finally turning the tables on them was intoxicating. I started making calls the next day. The moment I decided to act, a calmness washed over me, as if all the years of hurt had distilled into a clear purpose. I was going to take back what was taken from me. If they believed I was only ever lucky to live under their roof, then I would make that roof mine and see how their luck fared. The first step was gathering the money. Late into that night, after seeing the estate sale post, I spread out all my financial records on my kitchen table. My hands trembled slightly as I calculated my savings and assets. Years of scrimping had left me with a decent sum, but not quite enough to outright buy a house in one go. The housing market in our old neighborhood had slumped, which was in my favor, but I'd still need more funds. I considered taking a loan from the bank, but time was short, and I wasn't sure I could secure one quickly enough. In the end, swallowing my pride once more, I reached out to the one person I trusted, my boss, Don. Don was surprised to hear from me about a personal matter. I'd always kept things strictly professional. I met him at the garage after hours, the smell of oil and steel around us as familiar comfort. I told him I was looking to invest in a property and needed a short-term loan. I framed it as a savvy business decision. The house was likely to sell below market value due to foreclosure, and I could potentially fix it up and resell for profit. It wasn't entirely a lie, but I left out the personal vendetta. Don stroked his chin thoughtfully. Perhaps my years of hard work had earned his respect, or maybe he just saw a chance to help and make a little interest on the side. Either way, after a pause, he said, "All right, kid, I'll front you some. But this best not interfere with your work here." I assured him it wouldn't, and we shook hands. I felt a surge of gratitude and vindication. Someone finally believed in me enough to stake money on my word, a stark contrast to my parents, who never believed I'd amount to anything. With Don's loan and my savings combined, I scraped together just enough for a competitive bid. The foreclosure auction was scheduled for the following week on the courthouse steps. Those 7 days crawled by, each one filled with a mix of anxious anticipation and vivid daydreams of what I'd do when the house was mine. I drove by my old neighborhood a couple of times, under cover of night parking at the corner, just to stare at the dark silhouette of the house. Memories would assault me. Echoes of my mother's shouting, flashes of my father's cold eyes at the window. But now there was a grim satisfaction in knowing they were the ones feeling fear and uncertainty inside those walls. The power dynamics were shifting at last, and I was the one engineering it. On the morning of the auction, I dressed in my best button-down shirt and slacks, an outfit far removed from the grease-stained coveralls I usually wore. I wanted to appear confident and successful, to feel that way too. At the courthouse steps, a small crowd gathered, a few local real estate speculators, curious onlookers, and strangers who were likely representing the bank. I scanned around for any sign of my parents, but neither they nor anyone I recognized was there. Perhaps they were too ashamed or broken to attend, or maybe they simply couldn't bear to watch their home sold off. Fine by me. My heart thundered in my chest as the auctioneer read out the property details for my childhood home. Bidding started at a rock-bottom price, the amount of the outstanding mortgage. A couple of bidders raised the price in small increments. I jumped in, my voice surprisingly steady, as I made an offer slightly above the last. The back and forth continued in a blur of numbers. One of the speculators seemed determined, but I was more so. With each raise of my bid, I felt like I was claiming a piece of my past, turning it to my advantage. Finally, at a number that represented nearly everything, I had the gavel struck. Sold. Just like that, the house was mine. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The auctioneer took my information and a cashier's check for the deposit. It felt surreal. I walked away from the courthouse clutching a stack of paperwork. My name listed as the buyer of 128 Maple Drive, the address of so many nightmares. There was still the formality of the final payment and deed transfer in a few days, but essentially I had done it. I owned the house that used to own me. Instead of elation, I felt a strange hollowness mixed with resolve. This was never about the house itself, but about what it represented. There was one more step to complete my revenge. I had to face them on my terms under my roof. 2 days later, the sale was finalized. I held the new deed in my hand, the paper still warm from the printer at the title office. My name was there in bold print, and my parents' names were nowhere on it. They had officially lost everything, and they didn't even know yet that it was me who now held their former sanctuary. I decided to deliver the news in person. I could have let the sheriff's office or the bank notify them of the eviction. That would happen soon enough if I did nothing. But I wanted to see their faces. I wanted to be the one to tell them time was up. Perhaps that was cruel of me, but after all the cruelty I had endured, I felt justified. That evening, I drove to the house. The sun was setting in a fiery blaze of orange and red, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban street. It was eerily silent as I parked my car along the curb. In my mind, I had envisioned this moment 1,000 times, sometimes confronting them with righteous anger, other times with cold indifference. In reality, my hands were shaking a little as I stepped out of the car. I steadied myself with a deep breath. Walking up the path to the front door brought a flood of déjà vu. I noticed the cracks in the driveway I used to hop over as a kid, the flower bed now overgrown with weeds where I once pulled dandelions for a Mother's Day bouquet that was thrown in the trash. My heart was pounding, but not with fear this time, with anticipation. I climbed the 3 porch steps, the wood creaking under my weight just as it used to. This was it, the culmination of years of pain and years of toil. I raised my hand and knocked firmly on the door, my door now, and prepared to face the ghosts of my past made flesh. The door opened and I came face to face with my mother. For a second, she just stared at me as if seeing a ghost. I can only imagine what she saw, a grown man she barely recognized as the boy she'd thrown out. I had filled out standing taller and broader than my teenage self. My once timid eyes were steady now. Recognition slowly dawned in her expression, followed by a flicker of something else. Was it fear or guilt? I couldn't be sure, because it quickly twisted into the familiar mask of disdain. "What are you doing here?" she spat, voice sharp. There was no warmth, no motherly surprise or relief at seeing her only child after so many years. Before I could answer, my father appeared behind her in the entryway. His hair had grayed, and he looked thinner, wearier than I remembered. Life had not been kind to them lately, that much was evident. His eyes narrowed when he saw me. "You got some nerve coming here," he growled, though I noticed his voice lacked some of the iron it once had. I stepped forward onto the threshold, but did not cross it fully. Technically, as the new owner, I didn't need an invitation inside, but I wasn't ready to push in just yet. I wanted to savor this moment. "Hello, Mother, Father," I said evenly, giving them a small nod. My mother's lips pressed into a hard line. "If you're looking for money or something, you're out of luck. We have nothing to give you," she snapped, folding her arms. The irony of that statement almost made me laugh. They truly had no idea why I was here. "I'm not here for money," I replied, keeping my tone measured. "I came to talk about the house." At that, my father's brow furrowed. He and my mother exchanged a glance. I could see a flash of panic in their eyes at the mention of the house. Perhaps they thought I was some opportunist coming to pick at the carcass of their misfortune. Maybe they assumed I'd heard about the foreclosure and was here to gloat. My father stepped forward, his jaw set. "Well, you're too late," he said bitterly. "The bank's taken it. We're just figuring things out." His attempt at sounding defiant was undercut by the tremor in his voice. I realized then that they were scared of losing the only thing they had left. "The bank didn't take it yet," I said quietly, reaching into my jacket pocket. I pulled out the folded sheaf of papers that was the deed and the sale documents. "I bought it." My mother blinked, not comprehending. "What? What are you talking about?" she stammered. I unfolded the deed and held it out. "The house, I bought it at the auction. It belongs to me now." For a moment, the only sound was the evening breeze rustling the overgrown bushes by the porch. My parents stood frozen. My mother's face had gone pale, her mouth opening and closing wordlessly. My father snatched the papers from my hand and scanned them, his eyes widening as he saw my name listed as the owner. This is a joke," he said, though. His voice quavered. "How could you afford—" He trailed off, realizing the truth staring him in the face. I stepped fully into the doorway, now my heart pounding with adrenaline and something like grim triumph. I worked. I saved. Unlike you two, I built a life. And when I saw a chance to get this house, I took it. My mother finally found her voice shrill and edged with desperation. "You can't do this to us. This is our home." I looked at her, this woman who had given me life but no love, and felt an unexpected calm. Was it really a home to anyone? I asked softly. It was never a home to me. Just a roof I was lucky to live under, remember? She flinched as if I'd struck her. My father's face darkened. "We're your parents," he snarled. "How dare you come in here and parents?" I cut him off, my voice rising. Years of pent-up emotion swelled in my chest. "You threw me out the first chance you got. You left me to fend for myself with nothing. I almost died out there, did you know that?" My voice shook now, anger lacing each word. "Of course you don't. You never once tried to find me or see if I was alive." My mother's eyes darted away, and I caught a glimpse of shame there, but she quickly hardened. "Don't turn this on us," she hissed. "You think you can waltz back in and judge us. You were always ungrateful." "Ungrateful," I let out a bitter laugh that echoed in the front hall. "I'm here because of what you did. Everything I've become, everything I have is in spite of you, not thanks to you. And now it's come to this." I gestured around at the house, that familiar entryway where I had once cowered as a child under their scorn. "The almighty roof you lorded over me, it's mine now. And I'm here to tell you that you're the ones who don't belong under it anymore." My father crumpled the deed papers in his fist, his face turning red. "You little bastard!" He barked and suddenly lunged toward me as if to grab my collar like he used to when I was smaller. But I was not that frightened boy anymore. I stood my ground, and he hesitated. Perhaps he realized that I was now as tall as him, if not taller, and physical intimidation wouldn't work. He resorted instead to words. "After all we did for you, this is how you repay us. We gave you a life, a home. You gave me hell," I snapped, stepping closer to him. He actually backed up a step. I could see his bravado faltering. "You called me a mistake every day of my life. You beat me down, made me believe I was worthless. The only gift you ever gave was a roof over my head, and even that you ripped away as soon as you could." My mother started sobbing then. Harsh, angry sobs. "We raised you, we fed you," she cried. "You have no idea the stress we were under. You think you can judge us now because you have some money, because you got lucky." A cold anger flashed through me. "Lucky," I echoed softly. "You're still using that word. You told me I was lucky to live here, lucky you didn't throw me out sooner. Well, how lucky do you feel now?" She continued to cry, covering her face with her hands. My father put a shaking arm around her, his own eyes glistening now. Whether from anger or the sting of truth, I wasn't sure. Perhaps for the first time I saw them not as towering monsters, but as two aging, broken people who had finally reaped the consequences of their cruelty. It made me feel almost nothing. The pity I thought I might feel didn't come. They had made their choices, and I was making mine. "I own this house," I said steadily, "and I'm going to live here or do with it as I please. You two need to leave." My father stared at me, his voice a rasp. "Have you no mercy? We have nowhere to go. Everything we had, it's gone." I remembered myself at 18, standing at this same door with nowhere to go. I remembered the terror and hopelessness of that night. And here were my parents facing a similar abyss. There was a time I might have relished this symmetry with glee. But now standing here, I just felt tired. "Mercy," I repeated. "You showed me none. You left me with nothing and no one. I at least am giving you a chance to pack some bags." My mother lowered her hands, her face streaked with tears and mascara. "Please," she whispered in a voice I had never heard from her before, fragile, pleading. "We're ruined. Have you really come to kick your own parents onto the street?" I met her gaze, and for a moment I just looked at her. This woman who had haunted me, hurt me, who I had spent years hating, now begging me. I felt a pang deep in my chest, maybe the last vestige of the child in me who yearned for her love. But I steeled myself. One moment of soft-heartedness, and all my years of suffering would mean nothing. "Yes," I said, my tone final. "I have." My father closed his eyes, and I heard him exhale a ragged breath as he pulled my mother closer. She broke into fresh sobs against his shoulder. I let the silence hang for a beat, the weight of reality sinking in for all of us. "You have 48 hours, I said quietly. 2 days. That's more time than you ever gave me." My father opened his eyes and looked at me with a mix of hatred and sorrow. My mother was clinging to him, her body shaking. I felt a strange, detached calm as I spoke the next words. "If you're not out by then, I'll have the sheriff remove you. And if you damage anything on the way out, I'll press charges. Understand?" He gave a small, defeated nod. I could see fight and pride draining out of him, replaced by humiliation. My mother didn't respond, except to cry harder. I stepped back toward the open door. "I suggest you start packing," I said, each word measured. I glanced around once more at the foyer, the living room beyond, where so many bitter memories played out. How small it all looked now. How small they seemed. Neither of them replied. They were crumpled together, a tableau of despair in the hallway, as the last light of dusk filtered through the doorway behind me. I turned and walked out into the cool evening. The sky had deepened to purple, and the first stars were coming out. Behind me, I heard the faint sound of the door closing as my parents collapsed into their private misery. As I made my way to my car, I felt a weight in my chest that I hadn't anticipated. Triumph, yes, but also an emptiness. The confrontation was over. I had won. So why did it feel like something was still unresolved inside me? I pushed that thought away for now. There would be time to sort through those feelings later. For now, justice had been served in the most personal way imaginable. 48 hours later, I stood once more at the front of the house. My house. The air was crisp and cool in the early morning light. I had given them 2 days, and I had kept my distance in the interim, busying myself with work and trying not to dwell on what might be happening inside those walls. Now it was time to see it through. There was no moving truck, no car in the driveway. The curtains were drawn, and the place looked deserted. For a moment I wondered if they had run off in the night, maybe to escape the humiliation of facing me again. I approached the front door, heart thumping softly. Finding it unlocked, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The house was silent and empty. It was a strange feeling. The last time I had entered this foyer, it was filled with confrontation and angry voices. Now there was just the echo of my footsteps. The hallway was cluttered with a few discarded items, an old lamp, some plastic bags filled with trash things they must have decided weren't worth taking. It struck me how similar this scene was to when I left at 18. Back then, it was me with a single bag at the door leaving behind everything. Now they were the ones who had packed up their lives and gone. I wandered through each room slowly. In the living room, a couple of sofa cushions were missing, taken perhaps to sleep on elsewhere. The coffee table was gone, likely sold off at the estate sale. The kitchen cupboards hung open barren. I opened the fridge and found it empty, and unplugged, a faint smell of spoiled food lingering. They really had lost everything. Even the basic appliances were sold or broken. As I climbed the stairs, memories tugged at me. My hand trailed the banister where I used to slide down as a small child, back when I was too young to understand how unloved I was. The second-floor hallway still had the faint marks on the wall where I once drew with crayon and got severely punished for it. I passed my parents' bedroom. Empty closet doors, ajar hangers strewn on the floor. I paused at the doorway of my old bedroom. Pushing it open, I was greeted by musty air and dust motes dancing in the light from the window. They hadn't bothered to use this room after I was gone. It was left almost untouched, like a tomb. The ugly olive-green wallpaper my mother had picked for me as a child still peeled at the corners. I noticed a few faint discolorations on one wall. I realized after a moment what they were: remnants of the poster and photos I had taped up in my teenage years, things I'd torn down in anger or despair. I stood in the center of the room, the silence pressing in. This was the room where I had cried myself to sleep countless nights. The room where I'd agonized over what I'd done wrong to be born unwanted. The room where I'd packed my meager belongings the night I was cast out. And now here I was, full circle, alive, stronger, owning the very space in which I once felt so powerless. I sat down on the old floorboards back against the wall. The house was chilly from having no heat on, but I didn't mind. I closed my eyes and let out a long breath. I expected to feel an overwhelming sense of victory or satisfaction at this point. And I did feel some satisfaction, yes. I had seen justice with my own eyes. My parents were gone, reaping the consequences of their actions. They had nothing, just as they had left me with nothing. In a way, the score was finally settled. But sitting there, I also felt an immense hollow sadness. I thought revenge would fill the emptiness their cruelty left in me, but it hadn't. Not completely. It was like putting a bandage on a wound that still aches underneath. The truth was, no triumph in the present could rewrite the past. My childhood was what it was. Their absence of love had still shaped me in ways I was only beginning to understand. Winning this battle didn't automatically heal those old scars. I took a deep breath, absorbing the bittersweet reality. I had orchestrated their downfall, and I didn't regret it. They deserved to face the fallout of what they'd done. But I was also coming to realize that getting even wasn't the same as getting better. Justice had been served, but at a cost. The cost was acknowledging that I had become someone who could do this. Coldly turn away two people in need, even if those people were the very ones who had taught me such coldness. It was a necessary evil, I told myself. If I had shown mercy, they would never truly understand the pain they caused. Perhaps they wouldn't anyway, but at least now they'd tasted a measure of it. Eventually, I stood up and wandered back downstairs. In the doorway, I noticed something on the floor, a small photograph that must have fallen in the shuffle. I picked it up gingerly. It was a picture of my parents from years ago, much younger, standing on this very porch, smiling. My mother was pregnant, with me presumably. They looked happy. I felt a strange pang in my chest. I wondered what had happened to those two smiling people. Had my arrival really destroyed all that? Or were those smiles just a brief illusion before life's pressures revealed their worst selves? I set the photo down on a side table and left it there. I didn't need or want it as a keepsake. The past would stay in the past. Stepping outside, I locked the door behind me. I was the only one with the key now. In the light of the new day, the house's facade looked worn and tired. It needed work. Fresh paint, a good cleaning, perhaps new locks and windows. I realized I wasn't sure if I even wanted to live here or keep this place. Part of me felt like exorcising it, cleansing every inch and making it mine in truth, washing away the memories. Another part of me thought perhaps I'd sell it and close this chapter completely. I decided I didn't have to choose just yet. As I stood on the front step, I allowed myself one final thought of my parents. Where would they go? How would they survive? A younger version of me might have worried for them, despite everything might have felt guilty. But the man I was now knew better. They would have to rely on their own devices or the charity of someone else, just as I had once been forced to rely on the mercy of strangers. Perhaps they'd find a relative to take them in or a shelter to stay at. Perhaps they'd even turn on each other in their desperation. It wasn't my concern anymore. I felt no triumph in imagining their suffering, but I felt no urge to save them from it either. Justice can be ugly, I thought. It doesn't always bring joy sometimes, just a grave sense of balance being restored. They had set a terrible thing into motion when they mistreated and abandoned me. And now at last, that motion had come full circle to strike them down. It was done. I walked to my car with a slow, steady pace. The sky was brightening, a pale golden sun peeking over the rooftops. A new day. A new chapter of my life. I had taken my revenge, and with it reclaimed some power over my story. The rest of my story, who I would become beyond this point, was up to me. As I started the engine, I took one last look at the house in the rearview mirror. The home that was never a home. The site of my deepest sorrows, and now my ultimate retribution. I whispered a few words, not sure if they were a goodbye or a final release. It's over. And with that, I drove away, not looking back again. It's been several months since that day I reclaimed the house and sent my parents away. In that time, I've had a chance to truly reflect on everything that happened, not just the revenge, but the entire journey that led me there. I still drive by the old place now and then. I ended up not moving in. I decided to sell it after doing a few renovations. Letting it go felt right, as if I was releasing the last hold the past had on me. The profits helped me put a down payment on a home far away in a different town, where I'm building a life on my own terms. In the quiet of my new place, I often think about what this story means. In the end, my tale isn't just about punishing my parents, it's about breaking free. Free from the idea that I was unworthy of love. Free from the notion that I had to remain a victim of my circumstances. By taking control of that old house, I symbolically took control of my narrative. I proved to myself that I wasn't the helpless child they treated me as. I confronted my demons in the very place they were born, and I came out the other side. Do I feel happy about how it all ended? That's a complicated question. Part of me feels a grim satisfaction that they faced consequences for their cruelty. The scales of fate feel more balanced now. But another part of me grieves not for them exactly, but for the family that never was, for the love I never received. Revenge doesn't give back the years or magically heal the trauma. What it gave me was a sense of closure and the ability to finally move forward without the weight of what if on my shoulders. I no longer lie awake at night, imagining what I'd say to them if I had the power. I had that moment, and I said my piece. Now I can focus on myself and the future I want to build. In that future, I carry a sense of redemption. Not redemption for my parents they must find or forsake that on their own, but redemption for the scared, broken boy I used to be. I've learned that while we cannot choose the family we're born into, we can choose who we become. I choose to become someone who breaks the cycle. If I ever have children or a family of my own, I know the kind of parent I will be, everything my parents were not. Kind, supportive, and loving. Perhaps that is the truest justice of all, to create good where there was none, to ensure that the legacy of pain ends with me. To anyone out there who has suffered something similar, I want you to know that you're not alone. Pain can be overcome, and even if the road is long and dark, there is light on the other side. I won't pretend that every wound is fully healed. I still have scars on my heart. But I'm living proof that a mistake can rise above the labels others put on them. I was called a mistake, a burden, and so many other cruel things, but here I am, standing tall, sharing my story with you. I haven't heard from my parents since that day, and I don't expect to. Perhaps they are too proud or too ashamed to ever seek me out. If they ever did, I'm not sure what I would do. I don't think I have it in me to forgive them outright. Some things run too deep for a simple apology to mend. But I have forgiven myself. For years, I secretly wondered if I truly was the problem, if I deserved their hatred. Now I know I never did. In that knowledge, I've let go of the hold their words had over me. I won't lie, there are still nights when a memory will sting or an old insecurity will echo, but I face them with the understanding that those voices were wrong. I refuse to carry my parents' bitterness any further. I also recognize that I didn't come out of this darkness alone. I'm grateful for the kindness that others showed me along the way, people like the shelter counselor, who gave me a bed, the boss who trusted me, and even the teacher who once believed in my potential. Their compassion kept that last bit of light alive in me when everything else was dark. Now I try to honor them by living with compassion myself. I haven't decided exactly how, but I know I want to help other young people who feel unwanted or unloved. Maybe I'll volunteer or share more of my story, or simply be the ear that listens and the hand that reaches out. If I can spare someone the depth of pain I went through, that would truly give meaning to my experience. If you found this story meaningful, please share it. And I would genuinely love to hear your thoughts and stories in the comments below.